Welcome back to Kale Kids in Chaos. I'm Therese Nadler, registered dietitian. I'm here with Judy Converse, also registered dietitian, and we today are going to talk a little bit about the systemic issues in healthcare in this country. We'll talk a little bit about the slant from a pediatric side, but I think most people recognize that when you go to the doctor, it is a less than fulfilling experience for most. So we are going to dive a bit into that and why that may be, and what you can do to make it better for yourself and your
Right. Yeah, thanks, Therese. This is something in my pediatric nutrition practice, which I had for 25 years. I got earfuls. I got earfuls from families about the frustrations they were experiencing. Their children were not thriving, not doing well, and kind of how low the bar has dropped before anything is done to redirect that for a child. And even once it is done, it doesn't work, or there's still frustration. I met so many families who'd been to the highest experts in the land only to still have a really struggling child.
Right. And I think part of that is oftentimes our healthcare system is beholden to pharmaceuticals and, very large for-profit healthcare organizations. And so at the end of the day, healthcare today is very much a business. And I think it's unfortunate because most people who get involved in healthcare really do want to help. But it becomes a challenge with the time constraints and the amount of money that needs to be generated, by these entities, and therefore you don't have practitioners that can really spend time with you to address things like the root cause of what is causing some of the problems, the downstream problems, which are really symptoms that need to be addressed, and that's where all the pharmaceuticals come in.
Right. And I'm so curious for you, Therese, what pulled you into, here we are both with nutrition credentials, both our graduate degrees focused in public health nutrition. We're both registered dietitians. My undergraduate degree was in Bachelor of Science in Human Nutrition and Food. I mean, I was so interested in how health is created from the inside out with all the tools that nutrition and food have to offer, and that it is a science. It's not woo, it's not an opinion, it's an actual science. It's very well pedigreed. It's been around for a long time, but it isn't engaged in our healthcare system. And I would say I didn't really know that.
I was
Silly
naive
enough,
too. Yeah,
right?
I
So I'm
was
curious
definitely
about
naive.
that for you.
I so for me, my path was a little bit different. I actually out of college got into advertising and then I got into marketing and I worked at Whole Foods Market as a marketing manager and then ultimately worked my way up to become a director. So I was very much a part of sort of the natural foods, organic foods movement in the earlier stages, particularly in the East Coast. I think the West Coast and Texas, y'all had been ahead of us for a long time before, we finally got to the East Coast. So I was always very interested, based on my experience with that organization, in sort of natural methods for healing and making changes. And there were many stories that you hear of people who travel hours. This is before Whole Foods was everywhere. They would drive 2 or 3 hours to get to a market to be able to purchase the kinds of foods that were available at Whole Foods, that were not, readily available nearby at a conventional market. That's all
Mhm.
changed a bit as organics have grown, and you have had every player in the game enter the space from a retail grocery perspective, now offering organics at very competitive prices. Um, but for me, I've always been a naturalist. I've always been wary of taking medicines, even things like Tylenol and Advils and things like that. And I always believed that, you are what you eat. And you can, move the needle if you vote with your fork, right? Like you can choose who you support and who you don't support. Your money goes towards different, vendors, farmers, growers, depending on what they're offering. And so for me, I just always gravitated towards that. I went to University of Michigan for undergrad. I would go to farmers markets in the dead of winter looking for natural and local grown. I was the only one out there, doing that, pretty sure. Um, and then as soon as I could get a real job, I went to Whole Foods, and that really made sense to me. And then from there, when I ultimately decided, I wanted a career change and what did I want to do, I decided I wanted to get into nutrition. And trust me, my dad, as I was going through that master's program, asked me more than once, can you just become a doctor? What are we doing? This is a lot of schooling and a lot of time and a lot of money. And why don't you just do the extra year or two, and then become the doctor? And I just felt, for me, Dad, the doctor thing is not my interest. I'm like not that interested in pharmaceuticals. I'm not that interested in hospital work. I always knew I wanted to do something that, look through the lens from a different way is what it felt to me for healing. And that's how I
Right.
did this.
Yeah, I think exactly. I think physicians are in a really hard spot right now. I
Yeah.
don't think doctors actually get to do a lot of doctoring right now.
Or what they want, what they thought they'd be doing,
Right.
really, you know.
Right. They're very much beholden to what insurance companies are telling them. Yeah, it's very frustrating, I think, to be a doctor. So in a way, I'm as it can be frustrating to be in practice as a nutritionist dietitian as I was for many years. It's very gratifying because I was free to do what I needed to do to help kids turn around. And I saw remarkable turnarounds in children who had really been, I would say, all but abandoned by the
Right.
healthcare system
Yeah.
and given no hope, given no hope. I mean, uh, I have many, many anecdotes that are chilling. One I remember, and this is from several years ago. I had a family approach me. Their child had autism. They'd been to see the high specialists in the Boston area. A neurologist told them, "Stop hugging your child. He has
What?
autism. He doesn't know any better."
Oh,
And, I just heard so many heartbreaking stories like this. And
yeah,
of
that's
course,
awful.
that child can feel better. And if we want to, I know we can dive all into autism, but that's one example of a medical condition for many, many, many children. There's toxicity, there's dysbiosis, there's immune dysregulation, there's autoimmunity. None of those things are standard to screen when a child gets an autism diagnosis. And, this is one of the challenges in the healthcare system. It is all driven to sell you a patented product for as long as possible, whether it's a pharmaceutical or a procedure or a device. Once that falls off patent, the chase is on for the next patented product. Uh,
Right.
and that's a very interesting conversation that drives the system. And I think it's, as a developed country, we have pretty bad health in population health indices in this country relative to other developed countries, including things like infant mortality or our lifespan shortening or uh, obesity in children. We were also interested, since we just did our last session on measles, we were talking about what are the real nutrition deficits in children in the US. And there was some banter around on on media saying, well, there's no nutrition problems for children in the US, which we both were kind of choking on that. And I can vouch for what I saw in practice. Kids are not screened for these things routinely, very minimally, and they are not well, they aren't thriving. And it falls on families to start to pay out of pocket for that stuff, which is a burden.
Well, and also it's we touched on this last time too. It's just you really as the parent need to take the lead. I mean, when you have a time constraint, volume based healthcare model in this country, like we all do, right? You know that doctor comes in, you've got about 5 minutes with them. You're lucky if it gets to 10. You have to come in with the list of questions, concerns, issues, things you're wondering about, because the chances of that doctor or pediatrician picking up on what you're observing, with your child is probably slim to none.
Right.
And even then, I'd be so curious, like most of what I'm hearing is it's the schools who spend a lot of time with children, 6, 7 hours a day. They're the ones flagging them for ADD, anxiety, autism. It is rare that I hear that a pediatrician is the one, unless it's a very overt, obvious case.
Right. That
It
I
is
would
rare.
concur. Yeah, I would concur.
Yeah.
That's usually the feedback I heard from many parents over many, many years. And just to be clear, schools that's a little bit on the edge of legal for a school.
Absolutely.
They certainly can't tell you your child needs a medication. That's illegal. And, once, if your child ends up with some special education services, an individualized education plan or an IEP or a 504 plan, the medical part of that is, anyway, that's a whole other topic, but you are in charge. You are in charge. The school is not in charge. And that's true. What you have to remember that at the doctor's office as well. If you don't like your provider team, you can fire them and get someone else. And I encourage many parents to do that. This
Right.
is someone you need to work with throughout your child's life so your child can thrive and
Right.
you all can be well and happy, not just unsick, not just we're not sick all the time, but your child's actually happy. They can sleep pretty well most of the time. They can eat. They're not afraid to use the bathroom, or they're not having chronic GI issues, or they're not having chronic behavior issues, or they're not anxious. And what's so crazy is that's like a tall order now. I think
Yes.
these things are hard for kids now, and our healthcare system is not helping them really. I mean, those are harsh words, but the healthcare system does not make that easy.
No, and I do think that is in a lot of instances because the doctors are beholden to pharmaceuticals. I mean, I will say I do see a medication first approach often.
Oh, for sure. And that's official. Like if you look at the American Academy of Pediatrics ADD/ADHD recommendations, it's very clear, just give them a medication. And that's as early as age 5. And they have some recommendations around behavior therapy, but no, they don't say, I mean, there's so many nutrition components of focus and attention. I've worked with that a lot in my nutrition practice. I saw many children leave behind ADD, ADHD diagnoses. To be honest, I saw children leave behind need for school accommodations. I saw children leave behind the need for the medication for it. I also saw children reach a better treatment with a medication, maybe a lower dose or a different drug, once we corrected the nutrition deficits that impair focus and attention. And there's many of them. And your pediatrician has this much, zero training, zero training in assessing that, identifying that, and correcting that. They have zero training. And if they're telling you something like, well, there's no proof that any of that's real. No, that is untrue, completely untrue. I want to say too, in the trajectory of my path in my training and then working and going into practice and whatnot, when I started my training, different world, right?
Yeah.
It was old school. If you were reading academic literature, you went to the library, you pulled the Index Medicus out of the stacks, you located your journal, and you read the print journal. Those journals were in black and white. They were not full of glossy ads. They were not funded by industry at that time. It was literally pure science. Right. That is no longer true. And my impression is not only does the public not realize that, it's been very finagled with. There's even published research on the dilemma of ghostwriting in the pharmaceutical industry to publish, quote, science that's actually ghostwritten by the industry. So that did not exist. I'm not sure not only that consumers aren't aware of that, I don't think a lot of physicians are aware of that either. They take they're parroting what they see as word. And often there's not a lot of critical thinking going on.
Right. So the why is your child having this symptom or these symptoms is not addressed.
No.
And I think that, and again, that's because you have a volume-based, very short, amount of time with each patient. How can you possibly spend the time required to get at the root cause?
If your doctor's participating in any insurance program, you get a CPT code, which says for a diagnosis code XYZ, you are allotted a 10 or 15 minute unit to talk to that person. Usually it's a 15-minute unit, whatever, or 5 or 7 minutes. And there's an allotted payment for that time unit, for that diagnosis code. So even if you get to see your doctor and you are discussing what they figured out you should be coded for that visit, if you change the subject, they'll boot you out of the office many times. And I've heard many, because we're not talking about that diagnosis code today. I'm not allotted any minutes to talk to you about this other problem today. That's the math going on in their heads all the time. And it's terrible pressure for them. And they certainly can't deliver good care.
Right. And I think a lot of those conditions that we're seeing today are neuroimmune conditions that require a lot more digging, food diaries, discussion of gut health, food triggers, potential toxicities, triggering some of these, behaviors that we're seeing often in kids. And because they have so little training in nutrition in tandem with the very short period of time they're allocated to see you, this is where the prevalence to go towards some sort of a medication, take this, you'll feel better. But at the end of the day, all that does is mask and suppress what's going on in the body, and it will ultimately aggravate it and make it worse in many instances.
Right. And, to be fair, medications have a place and can be really helpful. If that's the outcome, fantastic. If that's not the outcome, there are other avenues. And like I said a moment ago, I've seen all of the above, where there's distancing from a medication that didn't work. There's replenishing found nutrition deficits. And then there's a hybrid where maybe there's a medication with nutrition. It can all work. And I think the goal I had in practice was to remind parents to expect it to work, to expect it to work. And so often, as you started off this session, Therese, when you said how frustrated parents feel, it's not working, right? And or they're told this is just how it is. Your kid just has to live this way, and the
Or it's
answer
a
to that
wait
is
and
no.
see, right? Like, oh, let's wait and see. I hear a lot of that. But I think you as the parent, you have an instinct, like, I don't need to wait and see. Like, I
Right,
something is off. I don't know what
right.
it is. This is not my skill set. I'm not trained, but I know something is off and we need to figure out what that is. But again, it's hard when you have so little time, and there is such a high propensity to go towards some sort of a drug, or it just, again, don't have the time, don't have the knowledge around
Mhm.
what, could potentially be causing some of these issues.
And I think another impediment for physicians, it would be so great to hear about this from pediatricians. There's
Yeah.
that somewhat dreadful phrase, standard of care.
Yeah.
So if a pediatrician veers, that let's say they're in a volume practice and they're contracted with various health insurers, if they leave that standard of care, let's say I've got a 6-year-old in front of me with ADD features, the AAP standard of care says I can give that child a medication today. I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to do Stratera. I don't have to do a nutrition assessment. I don't know how to anyway. I don't
Yeah.
need to know if this child's underweight. Just that will impair attention and focus. Whatever. I'm going to write this. It's easy. Next. Boom. If they did do something else, they're not going to get paid because it's not standard of care, and the insurance company can push back. And then they're in a little bit of hot water because if that starts to get noticed, if that's something a pediatrician is trying to practice over and over again, then they've got their state board breathing down their neck.
Right.
These are realities that I think are hard for providers right now that are locked into the system, and
Yeah.
more and more providers, at least in my region, in the Denver Front Range region, are going to a self-pay model because they want to do what they're trained to do, and they're tired
Right.
of being told by some invisible health insurance review person. One of my jobs early in my career was working for what was Blue Cross Blue Shield of Hawaii. I lived in Honolulu at the time, and that was an eye-opening experience. And to come to understand that there's kind of a rubber stamp floor where it's just no, no, no,
Right.
no.
Right. Unless your child is like, that's the other thing about, I think, healthcare today is like, unless your child is really severely ill, that's when you will get noticed and paid
Right.
attention to. But for many of these kids, there are things going on that are very like subclinical, just below what a test, will mark or flag or show, or even in, if you're meeting with your pediatrician or a nurse, right? They're not going to be aware of it.
Mhm. Right. And they don't have the training to be aware. Lab testing can be challenging in children. Of course, they don't love
Yeah.
blood draws. Then we're
Sure.
back to how does your physician code for that? How many times I encouraged parents to get some basic blood work with their pediatrician, like I would like a complete blood count, I would like an iron panel. And the answer would come back, no, they wouldn't do it. And I'm sure that relates again to insurance limitations. It's like, well, your child gets a well check so
Well
many
checked.
times a year, and that's secret code for come get your shots, and that's all they're going to do. They're not going to do anything else because that's not what is getting billed or paid for by the health insurer. So
Yeah.
making a separate appointment under a different code, I would often give families, look, I'm like basically holding the hand of the pediatrician, like, look, this is the procedure code, this is the diagnosis code, go get some blood work done. And I could authorize some of that myself. I always wanted to engage it with the pediatrician because I wanted the pediatrician in the loop,
To
as
be
the
a partner.
dietitian. Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
But
I found,
they weren't usually
I know.
interested. No.
I honestly I think every pediatric practice should have a dietitian on
I
staff.
know, right?
I
That would
think
be
that should
amazing.
be standard standard, because I think the value that could add to that practice and really, because the truth is that like moms move the needle on a lot of things. They get together and they talk and they trade names and they trade information and who do you like and who do you use? And they are like the social connectors. And so if you really want to move the needle on your practice, if you get a dietitian in there and you start having your patients, your pediatric patients and their moms meet with a dietitian, figure out a way to make that work financially. That is something to me that would be, so welcome from like the mom network perspective. But
That's a
one thing
great
I wanted to
idea.
ask you about, Judy, is constipation. So this is so common in toddlers, and as parents, you are told, oh, just a little Miralax, no big deal. Your kid could be on this 3 months, 6 months, it's fine, no harm. I'd love to get your point of view on that because I do think something like that is pretty rampant and pretty common today. As
Right.
something, that like the pediatrician is going to just dole out, like no big deal. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, first I'll say that I think this is a lot more common than it was years ago. The number of GI issues in young children is skyrocketing.
Right.
Everything from Crohn's disease in young children to simpler things like constipation to all these other GI conditions that I encountered. I had ulcerative colitis in a 2-year-old. I had Crohn's disease in a 2-year-old. This was unheard of in my
Unheard
training,
of.
literally not even mentioned in my training. So, toddler diarrhea, constipation, these things are, in my opinion, I will just share my opinion. I think these are artifacts of a toxic world and toxic food and overusing antibiotics and overusing vaccines. And we've done that now for a couple generations, and it has really altered the gut microbiome of humans, especially in the US,
Yeah.
and kids are sicker. And one feature of that is constipation. Now, of course, in pediatrics, constipation itself isn't regarded as a sickness or an illness. But as you might know, it can be incredibly debilitating for a whole family.
Yeah.
I've had entire families' normal quality of life collapse under constipation. Kids who have to go to the emergency room for cleanouts, repeated cleanouts. I had
Right.
one child who had repeated cleanouts. This child was also on the autism spectrum, lapsed into a coma in the ER because they were dripping polyethylene glycol, and it had just been too many times that this child had done that. So this is big. This is big, and it's not normal. It's much more common than it used to be.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because all they tell you is, oh, make sure they're eating enough fiber, give them some Miralax, and they'll be fine. Is there anything you would recommend or that you have seen work besides increasing the fiber
Mhm.
without relying on something like Miralax?
Yeah, so sure. There are other laxatives that are non-prescription. Miralax, there's even a Facebook page called Moms Against Miralax, and there's some 40 or 50,000 people on that page. So a lot of people have seen really toxic effects from using it long term. I don't know that it is approved long term for children by the FDA. I
I don't
can't
think it is.
recall.
I think that's off
Yeah,
label, but it's
yeah.
generally
It's
considered.
common. It's very common. I've met children who've been on it for years. And
Yeah.
the idea that they could just poop normally is sort of foreign to their pediatricians. Like, oh, you don't need to poop normally. It's fine. It's
Right.
not fine. You do need to poop pretty comfortably in general. So yes, for alternatives, there's many options. Laxatives can be had in different forms of magnesium citrate, glycinate, magnesium oxide. There's all kinds of products. You do need supervision with those. I think I've got an ebook on this. I think I called it Peaceful Pooping. It's on my website. It's on Amazon, Peaceful Pooping. And I go through all the things that I would typically use in practice to address that. Magnesium is one of them. I talk about different types of magnesium. I talk about what's an okay dose of magnesium. High dose vitamin C has a laxative effect, and that what that dose will be different for each person. I've also found that correcting dysbiosis, especially a fungal dysbiosis, in other words, if you have like a candida type dysbiosis overgrowth in your gut, which is, again, not something your pediatrician is going to find out for you, that's often a trigger of really big stools that are hard to pass. So correcting a fungal dysbiosis with antifungal herbs that I've used safely in children for many years, I talk about that in that ebook. You can also use some probiotics. I have found often that those alone less likely to do the trick unless you're in really big doses. And you would be talking like 50 to 100 billion colony forming units per dose. Now, what you're seeing on the counter in your supermarket is maybe 3 to 5 billion colony forming
much
units.
lower, right?
And so you can use much higher doses, and that might be helpful. And of course, fiber, things like chia seeds, flax, psyllium husk. If your child's picky and they won't eat those things, there's supplements you can add to that. They do need to hydrate to meet that fiber, or else they're just going to be more constipated. Right? That's a biggie not to overlook. The other big constipation trigger that's far and wide that I saw in my practice is these peptides called exogenous opiates. And we've talked about those. So a lot of kids are very picky for that starchy white diet, which means they mostly eat wheat and dairy food, right? They eat pizza, cheese, yogurt tubes, some milk. A lot of parents would say to me, oh, my kid doesn't eat dairy. And I always probe and I have food diaries. What they thought that meant was they don't drink milk, but they eat tons of yogurt. So they're eating dairy. And what can happen, depending on the child's status, is that can become very, very constipating because the milk protein in that, the casein, can be poorly digested and it will be absorbed as something called casomorphin. And that's very constipating, and it also has behavioral effects.
Because it's very addictive.
It's very addictive. It will, yes, it's also very addictive, so it will engender picky eating. Same thing can happen from wheat protein, which is gluten. You end up with an opiate-like peptide called gliadorphin. And opiate-like in that these bind the same receptors in the nervous system as morphine and other opiate drugs and will become addictive. And as you might know, if you've ever needed a drug like that after surgery, it's very constipating.
Right.
So in many cases, the only way out was for me to work with the family to either remove those proteins, replace them, or use digestive enzymes that are specific to gluten and casein. It's called DPP4 for short, or dipeptidyl peptidase 4. And I write about all this in that Peaceful Pooping ebook also. So there's a lot of things you can do. And usually using these other tools helps kids overall feel a lot better. It's not just they're able to start eliminating. They function better. These are nutrition impairments that you're fixing that have other effects besides I can't poop. So the other thing I want to say about those opiate-like peptides is they dull sensation. So a lot of kids that I've worked with had a lot of trouble potty training, and it was because they're addicted to those foods and they can't feel when they need to poop. And so they'd be having stool accidents. They'd be running to the bathroom at the very last moment, like, in the panic.
Right, urgent, yeah.
Because that's when they finally get the memo. So yeah, many options. You don't need to just eat Miralax.
Just double checking.
Okay. Are you glad
I'd say
you
that's
asked?
a very common one. If you ask most parents, they've gone through the whole, constipation Miralax thing. I'd say it's like less rare that you don't hear, you know what I mean, from parents about this.
Yeah.
And the other one that comes up often is the recurrent ear infections.
Okay, that's so interesting because one of the many things in our very crowded vaccine schedule is the pneumovax or pneumococcal vaccines. Those, I think, currently have 13 different strains of pneumococcal bacteria. They're supposed to prevent ear infections. It ain't really working.
Well, yeah. I mean, that was a common one that, came up. And I know also I just felt like the procedure for tubes in the ears, I just kept hearing more and more and more. And like, how many kids need tubes in their ears today? Like, is that really necessary, or is that more, again, the business of healthcare pushing people towards these procedures?
Yeah, I think the problem, here's what happened with those vaccines. First, they started out with fewer antigens of these strains of bacteria that make ear infection. I believe when my son was young, there were 7 different antigens in there. That's a lot. 7.
Yeah.
So that's basically like, here's 7 different types of bacterial infections you might get in your ears. Boom, we're going to jab it right into your muscle. And it's going to bypass all the normal layers of your immune system that would fight that and just boink, go right in. Now, what happened was they noticed that as they immunized against that number, those 7 strains, that more virulent strains were opportunistically available to infect kids' ears. So it kind of was a shell game, moving the protection around. Now it's up to, I believe, 13 strains. Is it working? I would say I've met many children who followed the schedule who had terrible ear infections and ended up with laryngotomy tubes anyway. So that's kind of the model in our healthcare system, is chase a problem with something you can patent and sell, and then keep adding the fixes. It's like more and more duct tape.
Right. Holding, this thing together. So you end up like the Tin Man, kind of rickety.
Right. Instead of going, wait, let's back up. What if we figure out a way to defend first? And how are these microbes interacting? It's like a race to the bottom. It's almost like what we've done, what we find that we did figure out with antibiotics. We overuse them. We overuse them in animal feed, animal production, and now we've got all this antibiotic resistance. Well, the same thing is happening with vaccines. The more we use them, it's really a shell game. Microbes and viruses are going to win. They're going to win. They always win.
And they're beneficial for health. I mean, this is
yeah,
how you build immunity. The whole
right.
idea, we're so sterilized today with all of our antibacterial soaps, and we're too clean, and that's creating a
Right,
problem.
right. And it's about, how do we live with these things? Not, we really can't kill them all and eradicate them all, and they don't go away. There's no disease that we have vaccinated away. When I was in my training, we saw the film of the last smallpox guy coming out of the trailer, and yeah, we got rid of smallpox. Well, that came back. And then we thought we got rid of measles. Well, that came back. So we thought we got rid of pertussis. Pertussis circulates now at about the same amount that it did in the 1940s before we had a vaccine. So all these things we're not winning. We're not winning. And what really works well is improving the body's capacity to live with these things and defend itself with all the multiple components that our immune systems use to do that.
Right.
Yeah. And that's a tall task for our healthcare system, which is set up to just keep adding the duct tape and selling the duct tape.
Right. And even just the rise in things like allergies and asthma today, compared to what it used to be. There's just certain things that I feel like are very common when you speak to other parents, or you have a practice and you work with parents.
Right. And let's talk too about, well, what do you do as a parent with all this? And you've got a child that's you need a direction with a child. I think one of the things I always encourage parents was, number one, expect it to be better. And if the team you're with isn't making it better within a pretty reasonable amount of time, go where you need to go. Look, do some research. I know that's hard. Like you said, ask the mom realm.
Network, right?
Yeah. Tap into that network and find out, how did other people really solve this problem? Not just, how did we just struggle along on the struggle bus,
Right. And oftentimes, if I can't figure it out for like a pediatric perspective, I'll go to the adult version and say, hey, who do you know who does what you do in pediatrics?
Right.
Or do you have any recommendations locally for someone who can deal with kids? Maybe it is an adult practitioner who can also work with children. I mean, sometimes when you're talking about functional and integrative, it isn't as clearly, defined as conventional is, and some of them will work with both.
Yeah. I mean, we had to patchwork together. We had a pretty abysmal experience with pediatricians when my son was a baby. By the time he was 6 months old, we were out, and he never saw another one. Never took him to the pediatrician again, because those guys were harming more than helping. That was quite clear. So we worked with a family practice physician. We worked with a homeopath who was also a family nurse practitioner who had worked in a pediatric group. We also had a naturopath. We had a lot of other helpers. We saw a GI person who was wonderful, a doctor, an MD. So we had to kind of put our team together, and I had no qualms about just elbowing people off the team if they weren't. I had zero tolerance. I'm like, look,
no patience, right?
No,
well,
and
it costs money, and it's time wasted. I mean, that's the other piece of this.
And your kid's growing up.
Right.
Like you said, you can't wait and see. And you and I know how long it takes the academic press to get around to deciding this is a thing to do now. Right. It's years. It's a generation can go, literally 20 years can go by before it's like, well, we think this now. Right. You don't have that time.
No, no, especially if your kid is deficient. And a lot of times, some of this stuff comes from deficiency,
Right.
vitamins, minerals, certain things, can
Mhm.
quickly close gaps or make behaviors more, less obvious or less, traumatizing.
Right. And the nice thing is kids do respond really quickly, typically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Oh, I've seen many instances where it's like within a week, you can see the difference,
a whole different story. Yeah. And that's just one of the most exciting things is getting that feedback from families in practice. One of my favorites that I heard over and over again, it's like the fog has lifted. It's like now that we have a more present child, a more communicative child, a more able, happy child, they get to be who they really are.
Right. And I wanted to ask you, like, when you're thinking about this, what are like the food and the feeding red flags for you that, like, immediately, if you're a parent and your kid is doing like one or two of these, like five, six things, you should not accept that as normal or something they're gonna outgrow, or like, let's wait and see if it gets better. If
Yeah,
you want to talk just for a minute about like food and feeding red
sure.
flags, what it is,
Okay.
you're like, okay, you got to go
Yeah.
see someone about this because this is not normal.
Okay. Well, this is so fun.
Yeah.
This is like, oh my gosh. Okay. Well, there's a bunch of them. Right off the bat, a real classic one would be a huge flag for anemia. And that would be like every time you get gas, your kid loves the smell and wants to lick the gas pump or like something crazy. Or your kid is picking up stuff off the ground, rocks, ice, dirt on the ground, chewing it. That's pica. They're trying earnestly to consume non-food things like wood, pencils, metal, erase, paperclip. There is a mineral imbalance there, and that, especially for very young children, causes problems that may not be repaired later. So you need to jump on that. That can indicate anemia
Yeah.
or iron deficiency, which are actually two different things. It can indicate lead toxicity or other heavy metal toxicity. So that's something to go, whoa, that's not cute. If your child's constantly picking up dog poop or whatever, check it out. That will require some blood work. Too bad, so sad. Get it done. Get it done. And I would actually go, if you need the referral from your pediatrician, fine, but go to a children's hospital. Go to somebody where they
Advice.
24/7, they're used to sticking needles in kids and they're going to get it done.
They have
And
tricks, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
they know what to do. That would be one. Another one would be severe picky eating. And by that, I mean your child's only eating 2 to 4 foods and they're 6 years old. They're not two.
Yeah.
Even if they're two and they're in a little jag where they only want to eat this one food, that should pass in about a month. It shouldn't linger because the
Right.
longer they're eating that poorly, the more they're going to build a deficit or some
Long
nutrition
term.
component, and it's going to affect their abilities learning. And those are more recoverable. But no, picky eating, common, not
It shouldn't go
normal.
on for years, though, I think is what
No,
you're saying. And it
yeah,
shouldn't be to the point where it's like, I've also heard of this where it's like, my kid loves French fries, but he'll only eat McDonald's French fries. Like
right.
that to an extreme where if your child is that particular about French fries that you have to constantly go to this one place to get them,
Right.
that, you
Yeah,
know,
that's a little bit weird. No, that and in practice, there's typically underlying pieces that are driving the picky eating. It's not necessarily behavior alone, even though that's how it's treated in our healthcare system. You have to go
right.
to a feeding clinic, and they're going to make you touch your mouth with broccoli and watch you behind a two-way mirror, and it's torment for a lot of kids. If there is chemistry going on that's driving that, you have to fix that. I would say reach out to you or me for something like that because the feeding clinic folks aren't on board with the effect of dietary opiate peptides on these kids. So picky eating that just won't go away. Another one, number 3, toddler diarrhea, I think is a ruse. Sorry, that's not normal for toddlers to live with diarrhea. I mean, sure, they're going to have a little phase here or there, maybe a week or two. They don't have a fever. But if your toddler has loose, wet, mucousy stool for months, something's wrong.
Yeah.
Something's wrong. And that's going to impair how they absorb a lot of nutrients and how they grow, how they sleep, how they feel. So fix that. And again, if your pediatrician is waving it off as normal, I disagree. And you can reach out to us here and we can maybe direct you.
What
Biggie, the
about
toddler
another
diarrhea.
one that we've talked about is the cravings for the sugar, the dairy, the carbs at the expense of, not willing to eat proteins or healthy fats?
Yeah, so that's a little bit in that picky eating category. Yeah, I mean, some of that is typical if it's severe and your kid is really addicted to sugary things. Yeah, that's not really normal either. Again, probably very common, but more than you might expect, it's going to start affecting their behavior, their growth, how frequently they get sick, and things like that, because they're just not getting or absorbing important minerals, nutrients that they need.
Right.
So, yeah, not normal. And I wouldn't get into battles about behavior with a young child, like you're going to eat this or you're going to eat nothing. No, just fix it. They're too little to understand. And many parents tell me, well, my kid's really smart. And then they're all smart. Okay. They're pretty much all smart. So no, you don't need to explain everything to them. You don't need to argue with them. Just fix the problem quietly, present, and again, it can resolve. That's often a sign of a fungal dysbiosis, by the way, that sugar craving thing.
And then what about sometimes with like cradle cap and eczema, you know what I mean? And sort of like those skin issues, maybe your kid gets a bite and they swell up. I think a few of those are also things where like, the body is not detoxifying. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's stuff that's getting stuck in the system that is potentially a
Right. The
problem.
body's really working and trying, and that's not a bad thing. I think what always I'm looking for is, does it resolve? How long does it take to resolve? If it's persisting beyond a couple weeks, a few weeks, then it's time to help the body complete that detoxification process. And there's many ways to do that. And of course, if your child is really uncomfortable or suffering and you need some medication to just let them sleep, or they're not pulling on bloody, eczema during the night, of course. Is it a lifestyle to live with steroid cream? No, not
No, if
really.
you've ever used steroid cream, it's not a long-term
Yeah,
solution.
you need it when you need it, but then let's look at the root cause. One of my favorite tools that as a parent I encountered, and I'm not a homeopath, but we used homeopathy a lot with a classically trained homeopath, a person who was a family nurse practitioner, became a homeopath. Really good for problems like that, eczema or detoxification. We had amazing outcomes with that. And I always encourage parents to look at that. One of my favorite books is an old book. There's updated editions. I think it's called Everybody's Guide to Homeopathy by Dana Ullman. And great handy book for home care, little things, the eczema, the bumps, the scratches, even broken bones, fevers, little sicknesses and things. We resolved so many little things like that without having to go to the doctor.
And then my last question for you is a lot of kids are very sensitive to like loud noises, right? Or environments that are very chaotic.
Yes.
How do you know as a parent, like, hey, this is normal, or hey, this is like definitely beyond the scale of what would be considered like okay
Yeah.
or typical, And what
Right.
do you do
Well,
about it? Because that can also be very limiting, for kids.
yes, I am really have really walked that path as a parent. We really lived in that dungeon, I'll say, when my child was young. As unhappy as it was one of the outcomes of his hepatitis B vaccine injury. There is some data on hearing damage from hepatitis B vaccines in healthy adults. That's never been studied in babies. Of course, it's given on day one. So we had a horrible journey with that, and it really limited our space. Everything from can't go anywhere with it as a dog, can't empty a dishwasher, can't play with your cousins. It's too loud. It's too loud. So if that's the cutoff. If your child is really collapsing in anxiety from it, then intervene. The nutrition components of that I found were meaningful, and I've seen this in many other cases, were magnesium level. So keeping that robust was really helpful, and addressing again that candida burden, a fungal burden that's really high, seemed to link up with that sound, that hyperacusis, sound sensitivity. We ended up doing a treatment at age 4 for my son called Burrard Auditory Integration Training. It was pretty miraculous. For the first time in his life, he could run. He'd never been able to run. He'd never been able to use a playground. He had really poor motor skills. And it immediately impacted his vestibular sense so that he could play. we could
Comfortable
go to,
doing.
yeah, we could go to a food court all of a
Noise.
sudden and eat.
Right. Yeah.
Ultimately, there were other interventions we needed over the years, but that's a really big one. And we got a lot of heat for that from family. It caused big rifts across family and friends. If someone had a dog and we were like, can you not bring your dog when you come over? Or we can't come over unless maybe your dog's out in the yard.
Or
It
else, right?
it broke relations off, actually broke relations off with a lot of people. Just that thing alone.
Well, it's isolating. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you're at a party or you're at an event and there's a lot going on and they're clinging to your side, you know what I mean? Because they're uncomfortable, like it limits your interaction, their interaction. And I think for a lot of parents, there's just sort of like, oh, what is this? Are we going to outgrow this? What is the problem? There's this frustration and a lack of understanding that there could be actual nutritional, deficiencies that are making this more aggravated than what could be.
Yeah, there are components of that for sure, and the whole piece of what enters the ear and then how it's processed in the brain through the vagus nerve. In our case, when my son was really teeny, he had seizures if he heard a loud sound, and he would pass out, sort of like what you hear about people with strobe lights.
Right.
So we were all kind of terrified quite a lot. Yeah, so we really needed to learn to mitigate that. There's an amazing book called Hearing Equals Behavior. And it's an old book, and I don't know the author off the top of my head, but it does get quite technical. But for parents searching for that answer, like, wait, is this real? Why is my kid doing this? It will explain. It might be a relief to see that.
Oh. Okay. Anything else we should touch on?
I don't know. I think we've run the
Jumped all
gamut.
around some interesting topics, I think.
And I mean, the bottom line is, yeah, your kids get to be healthy. That's my thing. I mean, don't give in to the system, right?
Right. Right. And your child is either responding or not responding to something, I think is the
Mhm.
biggest thing, right? There's
Mhm.
not, it's just figuring out what is the problem or what are they missing, that could help kind of keep them progressing.
Yeah, and there is something. There's
Right.
so many somethings out there. It's not just what you're being told at your pediatrician's office. They have one little slice of the puzzle. In my opinion, a rather small slice, especially nowadays. And there's so much else out there that you can tap.
Right. And I think you as the parent, you have an instinct and follow that instinct. Don't let someone who doesn't know you or your child or your situation tell you, oh, it's fine. I think it's going to be all right. Let's wait and see. If you have an instinct that there is something off, pursue it because more likely than not, that child, that there is something not right here. Follow it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can't think of a time when that intuition was off base when a mom was expressing that to me over the
Yeah.
years. So absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you as always. So much fun.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining in. We'll be back. We've got a long list of topics that we want to get
Yeah,
at.
absolutely.